everyone, I'm Virginie Hiver.
And hello, I'm Diego ODDG, and today we will walk you through the IRDiRC Orphan Drug Development Guidebook.
So I'm working at IRDiRC as a Therapeutic Development Director, and I'm also Vice Chair of the IRDiRC Committee on Therapies. And together with my colleague Diego, we have been leading this work. And today, in roughly 1 hour, we will present you with the methodology and the step we took in order to publish this Orphan Drug Development Guidebook. Now I will pass the floor to Diego so that he can present you a brief overview of the IRDiRC consortium.
So thank you very much, Virginie. And as I said, my name is Diego ODDG, and I work in Chiesi Farmaceutici as Head of Research and Development for Rare Diseases, and I'm also the Chairman of the IRDiRC Scientific Committee on Therapeutics. And the starting point for today's webinar is a big problem that the orphan drug and rare disease community is facing. There are more than 400 million people estimated to be affected by a rare disease in the world, and the vast majority of which are children, and the vast majority of those diseases are actually diseases that are ultra rare with less than 1 million per inhabitant prevalence. With that, there are more than 6,000, probably even more than 8,000 rare diseases in the world, and therefore developing new drugs for rare diseases has been proven extremely challenging. So far, approximately 500 drugs have reached the market in one major geographies, and that means that less than 5% of these diseases have been granted at least one approved treatment. And currently, there are less than 1,000 new treatments in development to treat the same diseases or the other rare diseases. From this big challenge stands the basic principles that are at the origin of IRDiRC, the International Rare Disease Research Consortium. Those basic principles are set that in order to face this type of challenge, we need a dramatic change in the ecosystem for both the research in rare diseases and the development of new drugs for rare diseases. We need appropriate funding, which in some cases means more funding, but in all cases for sure means a better coordination of funding. We should all work together in the same direction without wasting efforts, without duplicating efforts, all with the same goal of developing new drugs for rare diseases. And finally, we need a level of collaboration that has been unprecedented in medical history. To do that, the IRDiRC was set up. The IRDiRC is an international consortium that teams up both public and private organizations who are investing or are major stakeholders in rare disease research and development. In particular, there are 3 types of members in the IRDiRC consortium. There are research funders, so public research funders, 1, private research funders, 2, who are legal entities that are investing either directly or providing financial support to research and development in rare disease. And finally, the 3rd type of member are umbrella patient advocacy group, so patient organizations that are covering more than one disease and at least in a large geography. In particular, there are almost 60 members in the IRDiRC consortium, and as you can see, either funders, companies, and patient advocates are well covered, and we have prominent members that are research funders across the world, as well as there are well-known companies working in the area, as well as renowned patient organizations. And with that, 60 members, IRDiRC is covering all continents, and the number of members in this group are growing year over year. IRDiRC has set very ambitious goal for their own members and the community of rare disease research and development, which is to enable at least 1,000 new rare disease treatments available in the period from 2017, when this goal was set, to 2027. So we say 1,000 therapies in 10 years, which is far beyond what is the current productivity of the pipelines of industry in this area. And therefore, in order to get there, we need that change in ecosystem and development model that we mentioned earlier. In a way, the current model for developing new drugs has been created and grown for large indications, so not for rare diseases, and has been proven to be inadequate for the unique challenges of rare diseases. Due to that, in the last 15 to 20 years, a number of initiatives have started throughout the world in order to fill in these gaps. And currently there are hundreds of tools, incentives, procedure, designations, resources, best practices to support rare disease drug developers. But they are, in a way, not systematically organized and not fully integrated into the development plans of developers, both industrial and academic alike. So in a way, we have already a toolbox for development of new drugs in rare disease, which all of us can, in theory, access. The problem is that this toolbox is not organized, and all the tools are not well accessible, they're not easy to use, and a number of new developers do not exactly know how to use them and when to use them in development. So in a way, we need a new toolbox, which is more organized, include best practices, best standards, and enables all developers to use the incentives at the maximum of their possibility. And this is exactly where the IRDiRC Orphan Drug Development Guidebook task force and projects started to get to these new tools. And I'll leave the floor back to Virginie to introduce us to the Orphan Drug Development Guidebook.
Thank you, Diego. So yeah, let's move into the Orphan Drug Development Guidebook more in depth. So this first slide is to present you with an overview of the path that we followed in order to publish this guidebook. And it all started with a gap analysis that we have performed with the member of the Therapy Scientific Committee, which showed the need for a tool to help the developer to navigate the rare disease development ecosystem. So the first phase of our project has been used in order to conceptualize the framework that we wanted to use and to create all the materials that were needed for the first steps. It included these building blocks that we will explain to you in more details later on, that consist in initiative or tools that are useful for the developers. Then we had a tipping point in the project with a workshop of experts in 2018, where we have used these building blocks together with the development framework and case studies in order to better define how to use them and when to use them. Then the second phase, the last phase of the project, has been to, based on the outcome of the workshop of experts, to refine and expand all the material that later on are constituting the Orphan Drug Development Guidebook. So even more in depth, that's the question we ask ourselves in order to conduct this project. First, what are the essential steps throughout the development of an orphan drugs? And what are the important committees, tools, incentive, practice, and initiative that can be used during the different phases of the development path? And also, we have kept in mind very closely during the whole development how to best keep in focus the patient need at the core of the development phase, the development path. So again, important question, where? What is the most efficient way to use the available initiative? What are the pros and cons of these different tools? And finally, what are the gaps and the potential for the creation of new initiative in the future? So here you can see a picture of our experts. So this group was gathering experts in the field of rare disease and therapeutic development from various horizons, from various stakeholders, from various geographical regions. And when we all gather them together, we have presented them with a milestone-based drug development framework. And with those building blocks, so more than 100 building blocks, which, as I already said, which represent the tools, incentive, resource, and practices that we have identified as being useful during the development in the rare disease field. They were also presented with 3 case scenarios to work on. And they had to use these building blocks across the different phase and the milestone of the drug development, bearing in mind that the objective was to create this roadmap and to also create checklists of what to do and when to do it. Here then you have the affiliation of the different experts, and you can see that there is really a big mix of stakeholders with pharmaceutical company, big pharma, or smaller enterprise. We also had academics. We also had consultants. Also, we had some regulators and clinicians. And of course, we also had patient organization and patient advocates, as we wanted to have a real, truly patient-centric guidebook at the end. Then here is the framework per se. So we have considered that the therapeutic development path was a continuum, and that all started with the patient needs, and that the objective was to, at the end, fulfill these needs at best. On the line, we have put the different milestones in the development process, starting with the knowledge of the disease, going through the product discovery, the first in human, and so on, until the patient care and back to patient needs. So this framework has been mainly constructed around the medicinal product, so it's not suitable at the moment for the development of medical device. At the moment as well, we have not taken into consideration the case of repurposing and line extension. However, what was clear since the beginning, as I already mentioned, is that we have considered an approach that is less sponsor-centric and more stakeholder-centric. And finally, in order to address all the differences in the different geographical regions, we have merged all the concept around post-approval phases into one single concept that we have called market access. Finally, for a better readability for the subsequent exercise, we have unfolded this circle into a line. So you have all the milestones presented now in line. Then one more thing. We wanted this guidebook being really focused on the strategy and on the element that were specific to the rare disease development. So we have assumed that the traditional regulatory activity were taken for granted. So here you have on the screen all the regulatory activity that we have not included as building blocks, but that are, of course, always present when needed. Here now you can see the 110 building blocks that we have identified. For each of those building blocks, we have created a fact sheet that is describing its relevance to the rare disease drug development, its availability, its scope of use, the output, the pros and cons, and the best time to apply. And this was all created as well with the tips from our group of experts. We have classified the building blocks into categories. The first one being the regulatory building blocks, which are pathways, designation, and incentive in the 3 geographical regions that are the Europe, US, and Japan. We have another category which is about HTA and reimbursement, which is mainly focused on the practice and procedure to support the economic value proposition and assessment in Europe. We have a third one that is around early access, with the programs that enable treatment of patients before their regulatory license or before local approval, whether they are reimbursed or provided at no cost. We have another category, which is the development practice, which are best practice established by the developer in the field to improve the orphan drug development in terms of speed, quality, or efficiency. And finally, we have a last classification, a last category, which are the development resources, which consist in physical or practical existing accessible resource to support the drug developer in the orphan space. Then, so we have used these building blocks, I said before, with 3 case studies, which are presented here on the slide. We've tried to address as much as possible the different situation we can face in the field of rare disease. So the first case what was about a standard orphan drug. So meaning that this was addressing a traditional well understood pharmaceutical, small molecular protein. We were considering that for this case study, there was a considerable body of knowledge already around the disease. We were also considering that the patient population was sufficiently understood and that somehow non-clinical development was possible. And that for this case, the disease could be present in children and in adults. So that was the first case. Then we tried to go into less understood technology with a case that was quite similar, but focused on the advanced therapy. So taking into account the development of, for example, gene therapy, cell therapy, or gene editing. Here again, we were assuming that there was a considerable body of knowledge available, that the patient population was also sufficiently understood, and that the disease was also present both in children and adults. And then finally, we have designed maybe even more difficult case with the case of disregarding disease. So diseases that are really also less understood at the moment. We have made assumption that the prevalence was very low, less than 1 per million inhabitants, that we had indeed very few knowledge on the disease at the beginning of the development, that there was little known about the natural history study and other parameters like severity or prognosis phenotype, that the disease, to make it even more difficult, was existing only in pediatric patients, and that we might have no biomarkers or clinical relevant endpoints. So these are the 3 case studies that were used during the workshop of experts. And now I will let Diego to go more in depth into the outcome of this project.
One of the first thing that our group of experts during the workshop realize is that many of the building blocks that we have identified as important in support of the development of new drugs and rare disease had to be used very, very early in development, almost immediately at the start of the development, and this is especially true for those disregarded diseases. So in a way, this is clearly in line with the complexity of developing new drugs in the orphan space and the difficulties that many developers, especially new developers like academic groups and small biotech incur when they start developing new drugs. So we said, how can we easily identify where to start the development of a new drug? And we come up with this acronym, which is exactly START, that helps you remembering the key elements to work through at the beginning of your drug development. The first one is ST, that stands for stakeholder mapping. Then identify the available information on the disease. Remind yourself to identify the right financial resources for the whole development of the drug and secure them over time. And finally, generate your target product profile based on patient value, so that you, as always recommended from a strategic perspective, start from the end and then work backward, but with in mind the real final value, which is the patient value. So once you remember these four key elements, it's important to get into each one of those and ask yourself the right questions in order to identify whether in fact your stakeholders are there, the information of the disease on the disease is there, financial resources are available, and there is a product profile which is patient-based. So let's see this into the details. The first point is about stakeholder mapping. And here the key questions are starting, of course, from the main stakeholder, which is the patient. And the first question is, are there patient organizations already organized for this disease? One additional layer of interest is the possibility of the existence of advisory board already set from the community, representing patients, caregivers, and all the people living with that rare disease. And here they are generically called as community advisory boards. This is the first check for stakeholders. The next check for stakeholder goes into the presence of other stakeholder networks, especially of physicians and researchers. And here you have examples like the European Reference Network in Europe, the Clinical Research Networks in the US, and the IRDiRC initiative in Japan. Beyond that, are there general development support available, like platform or infrastructures? And we have the case, for instance, of the European Joint Program for Rare Disease in Europe, or the C4C initiative still in Europe for pediatric clinical trials. And more in general, one element never to be forgotten is to check the development landscape and see what others are doing, both from an academic and industrial perspective, do an horizon scanning to understand what will be the place of your therapy in the disease treatment at the time, or the projected time of approval. The next step is about the available information on the disease. And here the key elements on the information on the disease that are necessary to develop new drugs are, of course, the understanding of the natural history. So are there natural history studies which are complete and exhaustive in that sense? Are there diagnostic tools for the disease and the subtypes of the disease? Are there patient-centered outcome measures already identified and maybe even validated for the purpose? Are there biomarkers to stratify the patients or follow up the progression of the disease or the response to treatment? And finally, is there a good and proper coding of your rare disease in the systems like the ICD-9, ICD-10, or Orphan? And then, of course, it's the time to ensure that there are financial resources. And here we have to consider both public funding and private funding, of course, and your target profile has to be built around patient needs and patient value. So in a way, the key takeaways of this START checklist approach is that we have to understand as soon as possible if there are missing info on the disease, and if there are, those have to be filled in as soon as possible during the development. The same thing is for stakeholder. Mapping your stakeholder enables you to understand if there are pre-existing stakeholders. If there are not, a solid network of stakeholders has to be created as soon as possible during the development. And then, of course, all these activities, especially the stakeholder engagement, has to be considered a constant activity throughout the whole development. And in fact, what the task force identified is that for each one of those stakeholders, which we have re-enlisted here, there is a need of a continuous interaction throughout the development. And here represented as dots along those straight lines are the moment in which it's being considered by our expert as mandatory at the minimum to have an interaction with your stakeholders, which is, of course, at the time of product discovery, exactly to set that target profile, which is based on patient value, before entering into human trials, as soon as human proof of concept is available, and of course, when pivotal data are available and you're ready for your regulatory submission. Some of these stakeholders are not only research-oriented, but also clinical care-oriented. And so they are stakeholders which need to be continuously engaged throughout all the market access and the patient care phase. And by the way, these together with patients will be the stakeholders that will restart the circle that Virginie has shown earlier, because they will identify the residual patient need that will restart the development phase. Also, for funding resources, there are many funding resources available. Here, in general, public funding is easier to get for the earlier development phases, whereas usually it's private funding that kicks in the later phases of development. But one element that, especially for academic developers and biotech, has to be always considered is the existence of technology transfer offices, TTO here in the graph. Getting in contact with the relevant TTO for an academic developer, or to existing TTOs of various universities for biotechs and companies that are looking for opportunities for in-licensing is extremely important. And as early as possible, this has to be established. So at the time of product discovery, you see it by the dot, our experts say it's time to start having a significant dialogue with your technology transfer officer if you're an academic that is developing a new drug. Then, as Virginie has mentioned before, regulatory and market access cover more than half of the available existing tools and procedures and designation to support rare disease development. So we will now focus a little bit more on that. And you can see here that we can see the framework, which I've become familiar with in the last few slides, with all the key milestones in development. And then I'm going to show, like in a Gantt chart, all the various building blocks that we have identified as a major element into the drug development. Of course, the pivotal building block is the orphan drug designation, which is available in Europe, US, Japan, and not only. The orphan drug designation can usually get into various stages of development, starting from as soon as there is sufficient evidence to show the additional benefit of your drug, until the marketing authorization application or the new drug license application. So here our experts suggest to get the designation in all geographies as soon as possible. Of course, this changes from geography to geography. In most of geographies with innovative treatments, this is already possible before entering into human phase. For certain type of products and in certain geography like Japan, human data are highly supportive of the orphan drug designation and should be gathered before entering into the procedure. You can see here that we have represented the orphan drug designation as a line with a double arrow. This is the time frame in which by regulation and by practices, it is possible to apply for an orphan drug designation in all the geographies, but our experts identify with a single dot what is the best time during the development in which to apply, and this will be also the way other building blocks will be represented. Of course, the orphan drug designation is a tipping point in development, but there is possibility to interact with the regulatory agencies even before that. For instance, in Europe, there are two schemes. There is one scheme called ITF, Innovation Task Force, which enables to discuss with EMA in a quite informal setting many of the development issues that a developer can encounter even very early in development. And the same applies for cyber-related product in the US with Interact meeting, which is exactly there to support the developers at the very early stage of development before the formal traditional meetings are available. As you can see here, we are representing the overall development with lines that are in gray. And this is to show what is applicable to all orphan drug products, so the standard orphan drug case. And you will see, in addition to that, in orange, the building blocks that are typical of the advanced therapy world, and in green, the building blocks that are further needed to support a disregarded disease. So once again, you can see the Interact and the ITF are earlier development tools, and you can see that our experts also identify the best moment they consider to use those tools. In addition, for all SME, the SME office at EMA is available throughout the development, and once again, as early the SME starts interacting with this office, the bigger will be the advantages. After the orphan drug designation, both in US and in Europe, there are a number of regulatory interactions that are possible. In Europe, after the designation, the protocol assistance will be available. And as you can see, at every milestone moment in development, an interaction with EMA is recommended. In Europe, in addition to the centralized procedure, there is also the possibility of national member state scientific advice, which are extremely helpful, especially in the very early development phases before first in human. In US, in addition to the traditional type A, type B, and type C meeting, there are specialized elements like the spatial protocol assistance, which is available to design and support in designing tox studies and pivotal human studies. EMA and FDA together also provide a parallel scientific advice consultation, which is especially useful after the generation of human proof of principle data. And this is the recommendation of our expert on when to get to access these procedures. Of course, to get there very well prepared, you have to start thinking in advance of that and planning everything in advance, even before starting your early development trials. And we have represented this with this dotted line and open circle to remind that this has to be not applied, but considered and embedded into your development plan much earlier in time. For advanced therapies in Europe, there is the ATMP classification and the ATMP certification procedures, which are also extremely relevant and should be thought about and applied quite early in the development of the product. Same thing for the RMAT designation in the US for all regenerative medicine products. Most of disregarded disease would take enormous advantage of working with EMA on the qualification of novel methodology. And once again, this has to be started as soon as possible, because this methodology, especially if they are related to biomarkers, they can get already into non-clinical development and then being translated into the equivalent human test to be tested early in development and then confirmed later in development. That means that once again, once you know your target or a target for your product, this is something that has to be considered and start developing. The PIP by regulation in Europe should be submitted before your MAA, but also before any human trial in children. And for some of these disregarded diseases, this might be very early in development, and this is something that has to be considered. On the US side, there is the FDA drug development qualification tool, which also has to be considered similarly to the qualification of novel methodology in Europe very early in development and applied earlier on in development. Also in Japan, there are regulatory initiatives that are available. There is the regulatory science consultation, which is available to all developers, especially at the beginning of development in order to drive the advanced stage of development. And then, of course, there is the study group of unapproved and off-label drugs of high medical need, which has also to be considered throughout the development, especially in cases of repurposing. Most of these regulatory agencies also have programs to accelerate the development. So not only to engage into multiple consultations, but also to speed up the approval of products in a safe and effective way so that patients can access the products very early. So for instance, in Japan, there is the Sakigake designation, the front-runner designation for all products that are mostly developed in Japan and targeting Japan as the first country to be approved or launched. In US, there are a number of programs to expedite drug development. The fast track designation is one of those. Of course, once again, you have to start thinking of that earlier than when you can physically apply, so when you have an IND open. The breakthrough designation as well. And then, of course, there are a number of procedures, both in US and Europe, with the conditional marketing authorization in Europe and the accelerated approval in US that enable to submit your dossier with initial clinical data sufficiently supportive and predictive of safety and efficacy, and this could happen even right after the human proof of principle, depending, of course, on the quality and of the data. Then, if this does not happen, the next step is, of course, once your pivotal data or a first set of pivotal data is available, and we represent this skip from one moment in time to another in which this specific procedure is available with this open arrow. Of course, to engage with these programs, since they have very specific requirements and they are applicable only in specific cases, you have to consider that very early in development at the time of the start of your clinical studies, because you need to design the whole development program in a way that is suitable to get into these designations and procedures. The PRIME designation is available. The priority scheme for new innovative medicine is available in Europe, and this can be applied before or after human proof of principle data, depending on your legal status, and this is available to all drugs, but it's been especially instrumental in the development of advanced therapies. Priority review is a possibility that is available to the FDA, as well as there is an accelerated assessment in Europe, which is particularly useful in combination with the PRIME designation. All of these shorten the review period at the time of submission. And then in Japan, there are specific and regulatory acceleration program like the conditional and time limited authorization for regenerative medical products, which you see, of course, in orange, and also the conditional early approval system for medical devices when you have combination products with drugs and medical devices. And those are also extremely useful around the human proof of principle generation phase in order to anticipate the marketing authorization and the access to patients. More in general, in addition to the regulatory framework, there are, of course, specific patient and market access building blocks that enable to support the value generation and then the reimbursement and pricing discussion, but also to get access to the treatment even before that the product is approved in a specific geography. We have, of course, a number of initiatives in Europe for HTA advice, so for health technology assessment advices. There is the MOCA initiative, there is a UNETA network, there is a joint EMA HTA scientific advice, and then there are, of course, also national consultation, which are both with the regulatory agency and with the HTA body available. For all of these, which is recommended, as you see, multiple times during the development, depending on the agency, depending on the initiative, but in order to build up your value dossier over time, this has also to be thought well in advance. In addition to interacting with market access, with HTA bodies and market access agency, there is also the possibility of compassionate programs, which are available in Europe, US, and Japan at various stages. And those programs are available in order to treat certain subgroups of patients before the product is actually available in the clinical setting. And then, of course, for in Europe, for advanced therapy in very specific context, also the hospital exemption has to be considered. But the official framework of regulatory procedures and tools, as well as market access procedures and tools, is not the only one available to drug developers. There are also specific resources and practices that are available to the community to be included into the development plans. For instance, there are discovery tools that are particularly useful at the beginning of development in order to shorten testing or improve the testing and the understanding of your product and the mechanism of action, but especially also for disregarded diseases extremely rare. One possibility that has to be considered is the extrapolation of data from previous developments and other products. Patient-centric tools are also extremely important in order to design the appropriate endpoints that enable to capture patient value. And also in this case, even if the time to start applying those patient tools is, of course, at the time of clinical development, those tools have to be started, thought about, and designed much earlier in the development. There are innovative approaches for clinical studies, both in terms of design of the studies in small population, but also conduction of those studies and endpoints that are available for rare disease studies. And then, of course, there is the whole and big area of companion bioanalytics. And once again, any of these analytical development should start very early in development, and even when biomarkers are involved, these have to be thought about very early in time. So with this, I think we provided you an overall view of all our building blocks and the key one and the way our task force proposed the developers to use them throughout the development in order to provide a guide that is also timely oriented and enables all developers to understand what to do in the various stages of development. So in conclusion, with this approach, we want to, first of all, marry a paradigm that things are not starting from ideas, they are starting from needs of patients, and all projects start with needs of patient and end up with satisfying as much as possible the needs of patient, but also identifying residual needs that need to be covered by further development programs. That, of course, the start is always an important moment in development. It's a very complicated one for rare diseases. So our task force has provided the start checklist that enables you to mentally remind your stakeholder the available information on the disease, the funding resources, and of course, to develop your product with specific target, which is patient needs. Then, of course, as we said, regulatory advice is essential, should be as early as possible, and should be constant throughout development. And I think that the Orphan Drug Development Guidebooks provides an answer on what early means and constant means as well. So we provide suggestion on when to interact with the agency in all the considered geographies. The same thing applies to when to apply for and design and use regulatory acceleration programs and how to fit those into your strategy. And of course, the same applies for health technology assessment or payers. In early interaction with them is very important. And once again, the Orphan Drug Development Guidebook provides key suggestions on when during the development to do this interaction. And then, of course, everything ends with the patient care, and after that ends with the residual patient needs. And in addition to all the material that is available in the IRDiRC website, and we are going to show you in a minute, we have also recently published a general commentary on the Orphan Drug Development Guidebook, which describes more or less the same concept that we have gone through this webinar, and it's a wonderful starting point to get into the Orphan Drug Development Guidebook world. And as I said, has been recently published in Nature Reviews and Drug Discovery journal. And with that, I'll leave the floor back to Virginie for the conclusion.
Thank you, Diego. So here on the screen, you can see two links which point to the IRDiRC website. So all the material that we have developed during this project is available publicly on the IRDiRC website. You can find there, in particular, the paper, but also the whole set of materials. Okay, so let me give you a virtual tour from the IRDiRC website. So here you have the landing page of IRDiRC.org, and you can access to here all the task forces that are running in the IRDiRC consortium. And one of these task forces that is here is, of course, the Orphan Drug Development Guidebook task force. So when you click on it, you have access to this page that is explaining the introduction and the objective of the task force. You can also find the list of the experts that took place in the panel of experts that we run. And then you have access here to the paper. So if you click on this link, you have access to the paper in Nature Reviewed Drug Discovery. And from this paper, you also have access to all the material that is displayed onto the IRDiRC website with the link at the end here, related links, which brings you back to the Orphan Drug Development Guidebook Task Force webpage. But you can also have access to the material by clicking on here. So when you click here, you now have access to another page that is the Orphan Drug Development Guidebook materials, where you can find the list of all the building blocks that we have developed. Here, if you click, you have access to an Excel file, which is presenting you with all the building blocks and their relating numbers. If then you follow this web page, you can have access to the building blocks by type or by geographical scope. So if you choose, for example, to access to the building blocks regulatory, here you have access to the full list again, and for each of them, you can access and download the fact sheet. So if I take the example of the EMA protocol assistance building blocks and I click on download, I land on this page, which is the actual fact sheet describing the building blocks with all the different items and the tips from the expert at the end on how to apply these building blocks into the therapeutic development. And for example, if you click on the reference, you can also have access to the relevant web page in this case on the European Medicine Agency website. So if I now go back to the page of the guidebook material, if you continue to scroll down this page, you have here a PowerPoint presentation describing the basics and the steps of the development of the Orphan Drug Guidebook. And you have again access here, direct access to the paper. In the near future, you will find at the bottom a tutorial explaining how to use the building blocks, how to use the materials, and all the relevant information that you will need. And also, this is work in progress, but we are aiming at putting in place an interactive section which will link to an interactive website that will also present the material in a more user-friendly manner.
This is the interactive representation and material for the IRDiRC Orphan Drug Development Guidebook. And this is the home page, which includes different sections, the description of the key drug development milestone, the access to the start checklist, and all the drug development cases. All of this is accessible from the home page as well as from the top of the page where you can see all the links. So in the key drug development milestone, you can access the milestone description and then, of course, also open it up in PDF or download it for your convenience and records. Going back to the home page, we can get into the start checklist. Clicking there, you can see graphical representation of the start checklist, and the same graphical representation, of course, can be opened and downloaded for your records. But also in this interactive version, for each one of the key questions in the start checklist, which correspond to one or more of the building blocks, it's possible to get access through this little eye to the description of the building block, in this case, the community advisory board, and open up also the PDF with the description of the building block. Within the description of the building block, there are also, in addition to the whole description and the categories, the scope of use, and the tips of our expert, there is also the possibility of having direct link to the material and the website or paper or relevant material, in this case, the EURORDIS website with the description of the caps. Same thing for other building blocks. I'm taking this, the PCOMs, which is a patient-centered outcome measure. You can open up these, and whenever you have a reference which is not to a website, like in this case, that is the US FDA website, that is also papers, and in this case, the link access directly the paper. If we go back to the home page, then we can enter into the core of the guidebook, so the development cases. Here are the development cases shortly described, and you can also read all the assumptions that are behind each one of these. So taking the traditional technology, targeting a sufficiently well understood rare disease, which is our basic case, then you can get into exploring the case. And here you can see the graphical representation of all the building blocks used for the case, and once again, with the little eye, you can access specific building blocks. So if you want to know more about the Sakigake scheme in Japan, you simply have to open up the corresponding building block description and follow that to the relevant web page of the Ministry of Health, Labor and Welfare in Japan in order to get more information. Same thing, of course, if you're looking for instance, an FDA initiative, in this case, the FDA Special Protocol Assessment procedure, you can open up your building blocks, follow the link, and then get to the relevant page in the FDA website. Going back to the description of the case, you can also open up the full graphical representation in PDF and download it for your convenience. And this is for all the cases that that we have explored in the development guidebook. In addition to that, you can also review all the building blocks. You can access building blocks from here, from the top of the screen, and here you can download the complete list of available of the building blocks in PDF, as you can see here. But also you can conveniently download the building blocks in an Excel spreadsheet, so that you can filter and search for the building blocks of your interest. And here you have the building block number, the abbreviated description, which is present on the website, and the graphical representation in the website and the papers, the full description of the building block, the type, and the scope. But if you want to search a specific building block directly on the web page, you can also do that. You can look by the title of the building block. So if we look for the Orphan designation, for instance, you can see that you have all the relevant Orphan designation in all the geographies. But alternatively, you can also simply filter by scope or type. So for instance, if you're interested only in the Japanese building blocks, you filter for Japan, and then you see all the building blocks specific for Japan appears here. Alternatively, if you prefer just one type, for instance, the development resources, because this is what you're looking for at this stage, you can see here all the development resources across the geographies. And of course, you can also combine the two searches. So if you're looking only for regulatory building blocks in Europe, this is what happens. You can see all the building blocks. For each one of these building blocks, you see the description of the cases in which they are applied, but also you can, of course, access directly, once again, the building block with the full description and, of course, all the links to the relevant website and material online. If you want to know a little bit more about the people who worked on the Orphan Drug Development Guidebook, you can follow the About link. And here you have a short description of the initiative, and then all the acknowledgement of all the people who contributed to the task force and to the creation of this website as well, the reference to the relevant initiatives that are underlined, and a series of pictures from the task force work, and the credits for the pictures as well.
With this, I would like to thank you very much for attending this webinar.